Hey guys, tonight we begin with something surprisingly comforting. Because instead of dramatic wars or chaotic emperors throwing grapes at people for no reason, we're easing into the slow, steady world of Roman inventions. The kind that quietly made life better while nobody was really paying attention. So dim the lights, get comfortable, and let your brain wander a little, because ancient Rome, for all its chaos, was also strangely practical and very, very good at solving everyday problems in ways that still affect you right now, even if you've never thought about it before. So imagine a Roman engineer waking up early, not because he's particularly motivated, but because the city is already loud, carts rolling over stone roads, merchants shouting, someone arguing about olives in the distance, and he's just there, thinking about how to make water move from one place to another without causing a complete disaster. Which sounds simple, but back then, it was basically magic, because cities were growing, people were crowding in, and suddenly everyone needed clean water, not just a bucket from the nearest questionable river. And this is where the Romans quietly did something brilliant. They built aqueducts, long, graceful structures that carried water over miles and miles, sometimes across valleys, sometimes through tunnels, always with a gentle slope that made sure the water kept flowing. Not too fast, not too slow, just enough to keep things moving. And honestly, it's kind of soothing to think about, this constant silent stream of water traveling across the landscape, like the world's slowest, most reliable delivery system. And the funny part is, once the water arrived, the Romans didn't just use it for drinking. Of course not, because that would be too simple. They turned it into a whole lifestyle: public baths, fountains, private plumbing for the wealthy, because if you had money in Rome, you absolutely wanted water flowing into your house like some kind of ancient luxury feature. And it is hard not to imagine the slightly smug Roman aristocrat casually mentioning his indoor plumbing while someone else is still hauling buckets from the street, which is a very human kind of flex even today, just with fewer marble columns involved. Now as the water flowed into the city, something else quietly developed alongside it, the idea of sanitation, which sounds boring, and it is, but also incredibly important, because without it, cities tend to become, well, unpleasant. And the Romans understood this in a very practical way, so they built sewers, not glamorous, not exciting, but absolutely necessary, massive underground channels that carried waste away from the city, and one of the most famous, the Cloaca Maxima. Sounds dramatic, but really, it's just a very large drain doing its job, day after day, year after year, with no applause, which is honestly kind of admirable. Because it is easy to forget that the reason cities tend to smell terrible all the time is because of systems like this, quietly doing their work in the background. And if you're starting to feel a pattern here, you're not wrong, because Roman inventions weren't flashy, they weren't designed to impress in the moment. They were designed to work consistently, reliably, almost stubbornly, like a person who refuses to quit even when things get inconvenient. And that mindset shows up again when you look at Roman roads, which at first glance might just seem like, well, roads. But then you realize how carefully they were built. Layers of stone, gravel, sand, all compacted together to create a surface that could handle heavy traffic, bad weather, and the occasional overly dramatic chariot driver. And these roads didn't just connect cities, they connected an entire empire, making travel faster, trade easier, and communication more efficient. Which, if you think about it, is basically the ancient version of improving your internet speed, just with more dust and fewer loading screens. Now let's slow down a little and drift into something slightly more subtle, because not every Roman invention was about big structures or massive systems. Some of them were small, almost quiet ideas that made everyday life just a bit easier, like concrete, which sounds incredibly dull, and yet, it's one of the most important things the Romans ever developed, because their version of concrete was durable, flexible, and surprisingly long-lasting, which is why so many Roman buildings are still standing today, quietly outlasting empires, governments, and probably a few questionable fashion trends along the way. And there's something oddly calming about that. The idea that something so simple, just a mixture of materials, could create structures that endure for centuries, like a slow, steady reminder that not everything needs to be complicated to be effective. And of course, once you have strong building materials, you start building bigger. And this is where the Romans leaned into arches, domes, and all kinds of architectural tricks that allowed them to create large, open spaces without everything collapsing, which, to be fair, is usually the main goal when building anything. And these innovations didn't just make buildings look impressive, they made them functional, stable, and most importantly, long-lasting, which again fits that Roman mindset of practicality over flashiness. Even though, ironically, the end result often looked very impressive anyway, because sometimes doing something well just naturally leads to something beautiful, even if that wasn't the original intention. Now let's gently shift over to another area where the Romans quietly made life better: timekeeping. Because before you can organize anything, you need to know what time it is, and while the Romans didn't invent the concept of time, they certainly refined how it was measured and structured, giving us calendars that were more consistent and easier to follow, which might not sound exciting. But imagine trying to plan anything without a reliable calendar. It would be chaos, endless confusion, people showing up late or early or not at all. And honestly, that still happens sometimes. But at least now we can't blame the calendar for it. And as the Roman world continued to expand, their inventions spread with them, quietly influencing other cultures, other regions, other ways of life. And this is where things get a little reflective. Because many of the systems we rely on today, roads, plumbing, construction techniques, even basic urban planning, all trace back in some way to these early innovations, which were created not with the intention of shaping the future, but simply to solve problems in the present. And there's something almost poetic about that. The idea that small, practical solutions can ripple outward across time, affecting people who haven't even been born yet, all because someone, somewhere, decided that carrying water by hand was just too inconvenient to continue. Now let's float gently into another Roman habit that feels oddly familiar: their obsession with comfort. Because despite all the talk of discipline and order, the Romans really did enjoy making life pleasant whenever possible. Heated floors, for example, which sounds like a modern luxury but was actually something they figured out a long time ago using a system called hypocausts, where hot air would circulate beneath the floor, warming the room from below. And it's hard not to imagine someone stepping into a warm Roman bathhouse, feeling that gentle heat rise through the floor, and thinking, yes, this is exactly what I needed today, because some things never change, and the desire to be warm and comfortable is definitely one of them. And as you let all of this settle in, the aqueducts, the roads, the concrete, the quiet systems working behind the scenes, it becomes clear that the real genius of Rome wasn't just in its power or its expansion, but in its ability to notice everyday problems and solve them in ways that lasted, not for a moment, not for a season, but for centuries. And there's something deeply calming about that kind of thinking, the slow, steady improvement of life, one practical idea at a time, without rushing, without overcomplicating things, just quietly making the world a little easier to live in. And of course, not everything was perfect, because this is still ancient Rome, and they had their share of strange habits, questionable decisions, and moments where things probably could have been handled better. But when it came to inventions, to the simple act of making life more manageable, they were surprisingly thoughtful, almost patient, like someone carefully arranging pieces on a board, not in a hurry, but with a clear sense of purpose, even if that purpose was just to avoid carrying water uphill again tomorrow. So as we continue drifting through this slow, steady landscape of Roman ingenuity, just let your mind follow the rhythm of it. The flow of water through aqueducts, the quiet strength of stone roads stretching into the distance, the gentle warmth rising from heated floors. All these small, practical comforts that, taken together, created a world that was just a little bit easier to live in. And as we move forward, we'll ease into even more of these inventions. Some obvious, some surprisingly subtle, all quietly shaping the lives of people who probably never stopped to think about how convenient things had become. Which, honestly, is exactly how the best inventions tend to work. And as that gentle rhythm of flowing water and warm stone floors continues in the background, we can slowly drift a little further into the Roman world, where another invention, less relaxing at first glance, quietly shaped almost everything people did, and that is the Roman road system. Because once you build a road, you don't just create a path. You create expectations, habits, routines, and very subtly control, which the Romans were extremely good at, even if they didn't always advertise it in the most comforting way. So imagine a long straight Roman road stretching out across the landscape, not curving gently like a wandering path but cutting forward with quiet confidence, because of course the Romans preferred straight lines whenever possible, and these roads were not just thrown together, they were carefully engineered, layered with stone designed to drain water, built to last, and most importantly built to connect cities to towns to villages, and villages to places that probably didn't even want to be connected, but were now very much part of the system anyway. And once these roads existed, movement became easier. And with easier movement came trade, communication, and inevitably, the steady presence of Roman authority. Because a road is never just a road. It's also a way for armies to arrive faster than you'd like, which is something many regions learned in a very calm but slightly unfortunate way. As Roman soldiers marched in neat formations, probably tired, definitely dusty, but always on time, because Roman roads didn't really allow for excuses. But let's not get too dramatic about it, because for everyday people, these roads were actually quite useful. Merchants could travel more easily, goods could move across long distances, and messages could be delivered with surprising efficiency. Which brings us to another quiet Roman innovation, their postal system, because yes, even in ancient times, people wanted to send information quickly, whether it was official government orders or just someone complaining about grain prices in another town. And the Romans made this possible with a network of couriers and stations along their roads where riders could rest, switch horses, and continue on their way, creating a kind of early relay system that kept information moving at a steady, reliable pace. Now if you pause for a moment and picture this, a message traveling across miles of road, passed from one rider to another, moving through landscapes both familiar and strange. It has a certain quiet beauty to it, not fast by modern standards, but consistent, dependable, almost soothing in its predictability, like a slow heartbeat connecting distant parts of the empire. And of course, once you have roads and communication, you also start to think about organization, because suddenly you have more people, more goods, more movement, and that requires some level of structure, which the Romans, once again, approached with their usual mix of practicality and mild obsession, leading to systems of measurement, standardized units, and regulated markets. Because if you're going to run a large empire, you can't have everyone using completely different weights and measures. That would be chaos, and the Romans were many things, but they were not fans of unnecessary chaos, at least not in their infrastructure. So they developed standardized measurements for distance, weight, and volume, allowing trade to function more smoothly. And while this might sound incredibly mundane, it's actually one of those invisible systems that makes everything else possible. Because without agreed standards, every transaction becomes a negotiation, every exchange a potential argument, and honestly, people argue enough as it is. So having clear measurements probably saved a lot of time and energy, even if it didn't completely eliminate disagreements, because, well, humans are still humans. Now let us gently move into another area where Roman practicality shows up in a slightly unexpected way, their approach to law. Because while laws themselves are not exactly inventions in the traditional sense, the way the Romans structured and recorded them was in its own quiet way revolutionary, creating systems that were more consistent, more accessible, and at least in theory, more fair. Though of course, like most things in history, the reality was a bit more complicated, depending on who you were and where you stood in society. But still, the idea of written laws publicly displayed so that people could in theory know what was expected of them was a significant step toward creating a more organized society, even if not everyone benefited equally from it. And there's something almost comforting about the attempt. itself the effort to bring order to the unpredictability of human behavior, even if it didn't always succeed perfectly. And as we continue drifting through this landscape of quiet innovation, it becomes clear that many Roman inventions were less about creating something entirely new, and more about refining, organizing, and improving what already existed, taking scattered ideas and turning them into systems that actually worked on a large scale, which is not always the most glamorous kind of creativity, but it is incredibly effective. Like someone tidying up a cluttered room and suddenly making everything easier to find and use. Now let's slow things down even further and step into a Roman home, because not all inventions were grand or public, some were deeply personal, shaping the daily lives of individuals in small but meaningful ways, like glass windows, for example, which might seem like a minor detail, but imagine living without them. Open spaces letting in wind, dust, noise, and then suddenly having a thin barrier that allows light in while keeping the elements out. It's a subtle change, but one that makes a home feel more comfortable, more controlled, more like a place you actually want to spend time in. And speaking of comfort, Roman furniture and household design also reflected this quiet attention to daily life. Beds, tables, storage spaces, all arranged in ways that made living just a bit easier, a bit more organized, and while it might not seem revolutionary, these small improvements add up, creating an environment where daily routines flow more smoothly, where tasks take less effort, where life feels just slightly less chaotic. Now, of course, not everything was perfectly comfortable, because this is still ancient Rome, and daily life could be unpredictable, crowded, and occasionally frustrating, especially in larger cities where space was limited and noise was constant. But even in those conditions, these inventions provided a kind of underlying structure, a sense that, despite everything, there were systems in place quietly supporting the rhythm of everyday life. And as we move forward, just let that idea settle in. The Romans weren't just building an empire, they were building a framework for living, a collection of practical solutions that, taken together, created a world that functioned, not perfectly, but reliably. And there's something deeply calming about that reliability, the sense that, even in a busy, complicated environment, there are systems working in the background, keeping things steady, keeping things moving, allowing life to unfold without constant interruption. So as the roads stretch out into the distance, and messages continue their slow journey across the empire, and households quietly benefit from small but thoughtful innovations, we can gently drift onward, because there are still more of these quiet Roman ideas waiting to be explored. Some obvious, some almost invisible, all contributing to a world that, despite its flaws, managed to feel, in its own way, surprisingly livable. And as those long roads continue stretching quietly into the distance, carrying merchants, messages, and the occasional overconfident traveler who probably underestimated how far just a little further actually is, we can gently shift our focus to something a bit more personal, a bit more subtle, because not every Roman invention was about empire-wide systems. Some of them were about making ordinary days just a little smoother, a little more comfortable, in ways that people might not even notice after a while, which, ironically, is usually the sign of a really good idea. So let's imagine a quiet Roman morning inside a modest home. Not a palace, not a grand villa, just an ordinary space where someone wakes up, stretches, and begins the slow process of starting the day. And one of the first things they might reach for is a simple object. A lamp, because of course, electricity is not a thing yet. And the Romans, being practical as always, developed oil lamps that were efficient, portable, and surprisingly well designed, allowing people to extend their day beyond sunset without turning their homes into accidental fire experiments, which, given the materials they were working with, is actually quite impressive. These lamps were often made of clay or metal, with small nozzles for wicks, and they burned steadily, providing a soft, flickering light that probably made everything feel a bit calmer, a bit slower, like the world was gently winding down instead of abruptly stopping. And there's something very peaceful about that image, a quiet room, a soft glow, the faint sound of the city outside slowly fading as night settles in. because even in a busy place like Rome, there were moments of stillness, small pockets of calm hidden within the noise. Now as the day begins and light fills the room, we can drift into another area where the Romans quietly improved daily life. Food storage, which sounds incredibly unexciting, and yet, it's one of those things that makes everything else possible. Because without proper storage, food spoils, supplies run out, and suddenly life becomes much more complicated than it needs to be. So the Romans developed methods for preserving food, drying, salting, storing in sealed containers, all designed to extend the life of their resources and reduce waste, which, if you think about it, is basically an ancient version of meal prep, just with fewer labeled containers and more reliance on salt. And of course, once you have food stored and ready, you need a way to cook it. And Roman kitchens, while not exactly modern, were surprisingly organized, with designated spaces for fire, preparation, and storage, creating a workflow that made cooking more efficient, which is something anyone who has ever tried to cook in a chaotic kitchen can deeply appreciate. Because a little organization goes a long way when you're trying not to burn your meal or yourself. Now let's slowly wander outside, into the streets again, where another quiet Roman invention is at work: public lighting. Because while oil lamps were useful indoors, the Romans also understood the value of lighting public spaces, placing lamps along streets to improve visibility at night, making it easier and safer for people to move around after dark. Which might not sound revolutionary, but imagine navigating a busy city in complete darkness. It would be stressful, inconvenient, and probably not very safe, so this simple addition of light, even if limited, made a noticeable difference in how people experience their environment. And speaking of streets, let's take a moment to notice something that often goes overlooked: sidewalks. Because yes, the Romans had them. Raised pathways alongside roads that allowed pedestrians to walk without constantly dodging carts, animals, and whatever else happened to be moving through the street at the time. And it's such a simple idea, separating foot traffic from vehicle traffic, but it makes life so much easier, reducing chaos, improving flow, and giving people a small sense of personal space, which in a crowded city is incredibly valuable. Now, as we continue drifting through this quiet landscape of practical ideas, it's worth pausing on something that feels almost modern in its intention: public health. Because while the Romans didn't fully understand germs or bacteria, they did recognize that certain conditions led to illness, and they took steps to improve hygiene. Public baths, clean water systems, waste removal, all working together to create a healthier environment, or at least a less unhealthy one, which, given the limitations of the time, is still a meaningful achievement. And the baths themselves, while often associated with luxury, were also part of this broader approach to hygiene and social life, spaces where people could clean themselves, relax, and interact with others, blending practicality with comfort in a way that feels very Roman. Because why not solve a problem and make it enjoyable at the same time? It's an efficient use of effort, and the Romans did appreciate efficiency, even if they occasionally overdid it in other areas. Now let's gently shift into something a bit more abstract, but no less important: the Roman approach to documentation, record keeping. Because once you have a complex society, you need to keep track of things: taxes, property, legal matters, and the Romans developed systems for writing, storing, and organizing information that allowed them to manage their world with a surprising level of detail, which might not sound exciting, but it's another one of those invisible structures that keeps everything running smoothly, like a quiet backbone supporting the entire system. And as you imagine scribes carefully recording information on wax tablets or parchment, there's a certain calm rhythm to it: the steady movement of writing, the quiet focus, the sense of order being created one line at a time. Because even in a vast and sometimes chaotic empire, there were people dedicated to keeping things organized, making sure that information didn't just disappear into the noise. Now, of course, not every Roman invention was perfect, and some had their drawbacks, like the use of lead in plumbing, which, in hindsight, was not the best choice. But at the time, it was practical, easy to work with, and widely available, so it became part of the system. A reminder that even well-intentioned solutions can have unintended consequences. which is something humans continue to experience over and over again, because solving problems often leads to new ones, just in slightly different forms. But even with these imperfections, the overall pattern remains the same. The Romans observed their environment, identified challenges, and created solutions that, more often than not, made life easier, more organized, more manageable. And there's something quietly reassuring about that process. The idea that progress doesn't always come from dramatic breakthroughs, but from steady, thoughtful improvements applied over time. So as we let this gentle flow of ideas continue, from lamps to sidewalks to kitchens and records, just allow yourself to settle into the rhythm of it. The slow accumulation of small comforts, each one adding a little bit of ease to daily life until, without even realizing it, the world feels more structured, more navigable, more livable. And as we move forward, we'll continue uncovering these quiet innovations, each one a small piece of a much larger picture, a picture of a society that, for all its flaws, was remarkably good at making things work. And as those small comforts settle into place, the lamps glowing softly, the sidewalks guiding footsteps, the kitchens humming with quiet efficiency, we can drift a little deeper into the Roman world, where even the simplest tools were shaped by a very calm, very practical idea that life is already complicated enough. So there's really no need to make it harder on purpose, which sounds obvious, but is something humans tend to forget quite often. So imagine a Roman worker, not a general, not a senator, just an ordinary person with a job to do, maybe building, maybe repairing, maybe just trying to get through the day without too much trouble. And in his hands are tools that feel familiar in a strangely comforting way. Hammers, saws, chisels, measuring devices, all designed with a clear purpose. No unnecessary decoration, no dramatic flair, just reliable shapes that get the job done, again and again, without complaint, which, if you think about it, is exactly what you want from a tool. And the Romans didn't just create these tools randomly, they refined them over time, adjusting shapes, improving materials, making small changes that added up to noticeable improvements. And there's something almost meditative about that process. The slow, steady refinement of everyday objects. Not in a rush, not chasing perfection, just gradually making things better, one detail at a time. Because even a small improvement in a tool can save time, reduce effort, and make a long day feel just a little less exhausting. Now let's gently shift from tools to something slightly more organized. The Roman military camp, which might sound like an intense place, but in many ways it was actually a model of order and efficiency. Carefully planned layouts, straight streets, designated areas for different activities, everything arranged in a way that made movement predictable and tasks easier to manage. And while this level of structure might feel a bit rigid, it also created a sense of stability, a quiet understanding of where things belonged and how things worked. And this idea of organized space didn't stay limited to the military. It influenced cities as well, with grids, planned streets, and designated public areas, creating environments that were easier to navigate, easier to manage, and in a subtle way, more calming. Because when a space is organized, your mind doesn't have to work as hard to understand it, and that frees up a little bit of energy, which, over time, makes a difference, even if you don't consciously notice it. Now as we continue drifting through this quiet landscape, let's take a moment to notice something that feels almost invisible, yet incredibly important: Roman numerals. Because while they might seem like just a way of writing numbers, they were part of a larger system of communication and record-keeping that helped bring consistency to a wide range of activities, from trade to construction to administration. And while they weren't always the most efficient system by modern standards, they provided a shared language for numbers, which again, made coordination easier and reduced confusion. And speaking of coordination, let's gently move into another Roman innovation that quietly shaped daily life: the concept of public spaces designed for gathering, forums, markets, and open areas where people could meet, trade, discuss, and simply exist together. And while these spaces might not seem like inventions in the traditional sense, the way they were designed and integrated into the city reflects a thoughtful approach to social life. creating environments that supported interaction without forcing it, allowing people to come and go as they pleased. Now imagine walking through one of these spaces, the sound of conversation blending with the movement of people, the steady rhythm of daily life unfolding around you, and there's something oddly calming about it, even with the noise, because it's a kind of organized noise, a predictable pattern that your mind can settle into, rather than resist. And that's another quiet strength of Roman design, the ability to create environments that feel busy but not overwhelming, structured but not suffocating, at least most of the time. And of course, once people gather, they need ways to exchange goods, which brings us back to markets, but this time with a focus on how they were organized. Stalls arranged in rows, goods categorized, spaces designed to handle movement and trade efficiently. And while it might not seem revolutionary, this level of organization makes a big difference, turning what could be a chaotic mess into something that flows, something that works, something that people can rely on. Now let's slowly drift into another area where the Romans showed their quiet attention to detail: clothing and textiles. Because while they didn't invent clothing, obviously they developed methods for producing, dyeing, and maintaining fabrics that improved both comfort and durability, and there's something very human about that. The desire not just to have something, but to have something that lasts, something that feels good to use, something that doesn't fall apart the moment you need it most. And as we move forward, it becomes clear that many Roman inventions share this same underlying principle: durability. The idea that something should not only work, but continue working over time with minimal effort. And this focus on longevity is part of what makes their contributions so enduring, because they weren't just solving problems for the moment. They were creating solutions that could persist, quietly supporting life long after the original creators were gone. Now, of course, not every system was perfect, and sometimes this focus on order and efficiency could feel a bit rigid, a bit inflexible, especially when applied too strictly. But even then, the intention was usually the same: to reduce chaos, to make things more predictable, to create a sense of stability in a world that was often anything but stable. And as we let all of this settle in, the tools, the organized spaces, the quiet systems working in the background, it becomes easier to see the Roman world not just as a place of power and conquest, but as a place of careful thought, of practical decisions, of small improvements that, taken together, created a life that was in many ways more manageable than it might have been otherwise. So just let your mind follow that gentle pattern, the steady rhythm of problem and solution, challenge and response, each invention adding a little more ease, a little more structure, until the whole system feels almost self-sustaining, quietly supporting the flow of daily life without demanding too much attention. And as we continue, we'll drift even further into these subtle innovations, the ones that don't shout for attention, but quietly shape the world in ways that are still with us today. And as those quiet systems continue humming in the background, tools resting where they should be, markets flowing without too much chaos, and streets guiding people in a way that feels almost effortless, we can drift a little further into one of the most understated Roman talents of all: their ability to keep track of things without completely losing their minds, which, if you've ever tried to organize even a small part of your life, is actually a very impressive skill. So imagine a Roman official sitting at a wooden desk, not particularly excited, not dramatically stressed, just calmly doing his job, surrounded by wax tablets, scrolls, and records that need to be reviewed, updated, and stored. Because in a world as large and complex as Rome, information was everything, and losing track of it was not really an option. At least not if you wanted things to keep functioning without turning into complete confusion. And this is where Roman record-keeping quietly shines, because they developed systems for documenting land, ownership, taxes, census data, and legal agreements, all carefully recorded and, most importantly, organized in a way that allowed them to be retrieved later. Which might not sound exciting, but it's one of those invisible foundations that supports everything else, because without accurate records, decisions become guesses, and guesses tend to lead to problems sooner or later. Now if you pause for a moment and imagine the rhythm of this work, the steady scratching of stylus on wax, the careful rolling and unrolling of scrolls, the quiet focus required to maintain order in a sea of information. There's something almost meditative about it. A slow, deliberate process that values consistency over speed, accuracy over flair, and in a world that often felt unpredictable, that kind of steady routine probably brought a certain sense of calm to those involved. And of course, once you start recording information, you also need a way to store it, which leads us to Roman archives. Spaces dedicated to keeping documents safe and accessible, protected from damage, organized in a way that made retrieval possible. And again, this might seem like a small detail, but it's actually a crucial part of maintaining a functioning system, because information is only useful if you can find it when you need it. Now let's gently shift to another quiet but impactful Roman innovation, their approach to contracts and agreements. Because while humans have always made deals, the Romans formalized the process in ways that made it more consistent and reliable. Written agreements that outlined responsibilities, expectations, and consequences, reducing misunderstandings and providing a framework for resolving disputes, which in theory made interactions smoother, even if in practice people still found ways to argue, because that's just part of being human. But still, having a clear system in place made a difference, turning what could have been endless negotiation into something more structured, more predictable, and in a subtle way, more fair, or at least more understandable, which is often the first step toward fairness, even if it doesn't guarantee it. And as we continue drifting through this landscape of quiet organization, it becomes clear that many Roman inventions were not about creating something new, but about making existing processes more reliable, more consistent, more manageable, which might not sound glamorous, but it's incredibly effective. Like organizing a cluttered space and suddenly realizing how much easier everything becomes when you know where things are. Now let's slowly move into another area where this mindset appears. Time management, not in the modern sense of productivity hacks and endless schedules, but in a more basic, structured way. Dividing the day into segments, creating routines that allowed people to coordinate activities, meet expectations, and maintain a sense of order. And while it might not have been perfectly precise, it provided enough structure to keep things moving without constant confusion. And speaking of routines, Roman daily life was often shaped by these quiet patterns. Waking, working, eating, socializing, all supported by the systems we've been exploring. Roads that made movement easier, water systems that supported hygiene, records that kept track of obligations, all working together to create a rhythm that people could rely on, even if they didn't fully understand all the mechanisms behind it. Now, of course, not everything was perfectly organized, and there were moments when systems failed, records were lost, or decisions were made that didn't quite work out as planned. But overall, the Roman approach to organization created a level of stability that allowed their society to function on a large scale, which is no small achievement, especially when you consider the limitations of the time. And as we let this idea settle in, it becomes clear that the true strength of Roman inventions lies not just in what they created, but in how they connected those creations into a larger system, a network of ideas and practices that supported each other, reinforcing stability, reducing chaos, and making life just a little bit easier to navigate. So as you continue to relax into this slow, steady journey, just let your mind follow the quiet flow of these systems, the gentle rhythm of organization and structure, each piece fitting into place, each idea supporting the next, creating a world that, while not perfect, was remarkably functional. And as we move forward, we'll continue exploring these subtle innovations, the ones that don't demand attention, but quietly shape the experience of everyday life in ways that are easy to overlook, but impossible to ignore once you notice them. And as those carefully organized records rest quietly in their archives, waiting to be opened by someone with a task to complete and just enough patience to go through them line by line, we can gently drift into another area where the Romans, once again, chose practicality over drama. And that is medicine, which, to be fair, was not always perfect, not always effective, and occasionally a bit questionable. But still, It represented a sincere attempt to understand the human body, and more importantly, to fix it when things went wrong, which is something people have been trying to do for a very long time, with varying degrees of success. So imagine a Roman physician, not dramatically rushing through a hospital hallway, because that kind of urgency wasn't really part of the experience, but instead working calmly, observing symptoms, asking questions, applying treatments that were based on a mixture of knowledge, tradition, and occasionally educated guesses, which, if we're being honest, is still part of medicine even today, just with more advanced tools and fewer leeches involved. Although the Romans did, at times, use methods that feel a bit unusual now, like herbal remedies, dietary adjustments, and practices influenced by earlier Greek knowledge, particularly from thinkers who had already started exploring the idea that the body operates according to certain natural principles. And while Roman medicine didn't always cure diseases in the way we might hope, it did contribute to a broader understanding of health, hygiene, and care, reinforcing the importance of clean water, proper sanitation, and balanced living, all of which tie back into the systems we've already explored: aqueducts, baths, waste removal. Because health is rarely about a single solution. It's about a network of small, consistent practices that work together over time, quietly supporting well-being without demanding too much attention. Now let's slowly shift from the human body to something a bit more expansive: maps. Because once you have an empire that stretches across vast distances, you need to understand where things are, how to get there, and what lies in between. And the Romans approached this challenge with their usual sense of order, creating maps that, while not always perfectly accurate by modern standards, provided a functional representation of the world as they knew it, focusing on roads, distances, and connections, rather than precise geographic detail. And there's something very Roman about that approach, focusing on what is useful, rather than what is perfectly accurate. Because for them, a map wasn't just a picture, it was a tool, a way to navigate, to plan, to coordinate movement across large areas. And this practicality made their maps incredibly valuable, even if they didn't look quite like the ones we're used to today. Now imagine a traveler holding one of these maps, tracing a route with a finger, following the lines that represent roads, estimating distances, planning the journey ahead, and there's a quiet sense of reassurance in that moment. The feeling that the world, even if vast and unfamiliar, has been organized in a way that makes it understandable, navigable, less intimidating, which is, in many ways, the true purpose of a map, not just to show where things are, but to make movement feel possible. And as we continue drifting through this calm landscape of Roman innovation, let's take a moment to notice something that feels almost invisible, but is incredibly important: engineering consistency. Because the Romans didn't just build things, they built them in ways that could be repeated. Standardized methods, reliable techniques, approaches that could be taught, shared, and applied across different regions, creating a kind of uniformity that made large-scale construction possible. And this consistency meant that a road built in one part of the empire would function similarly to a road built in another. An aqueduct in one region would follow the same principles as one in a distant province, creating a sense of familiarity and reliability that made the entire system more cohesive, more predictable, and ultimately, more effective. Because when systems are consistent, they are easier to maintain, easier to expand, and easier to trust. Now, of course, not everything worked perfectly all the time, and there were moments when structures failed, treatments didn't work, or plans didn't quite go as expected. But the overall approach remained the same: observe, adjust, improve, a slow, steady process of refinement that over time led to better outcomes, even if progress sometimes felt gradual and unremarkable in the moment. And speaking of gradual progress, let's gently move into another area where the Romans made quiet but meaningful contributions: transportation beyond roads, specifically vehicles and infrastructure designed to support movement, carts, wagons, and the systems that kept them functional. Because a road is only useful if you have a way to travel on it efficiently. And the Romans understood this, developing vehicles that were durable, practical, and suited to the conditions of their environment. And as these vehicles moved along the roads carrying goods, people, and messages, they became part of a larger system of flow, a steady movement that connected different parts of the empire, creating a sense of continuity, a feeling that everything was linked together in a way that made life more manageable, more predictable, even if the journey itself could still be long and occasionally uncomfortable. Now let's slow things down again and return to something more personal, care and routine, because Roman life, like any life, was shaped by daily habits, and many of their inventions supported these habits in subtle ways, from medical practices to organized spaces to reliable infrastructure, all contributing to a sense of rhythm, a steady pattern that people could follow without constantly having to figure things out from scratch. And there's something deeply calming about that idea, the presence of systems that reduce uncertainty, that provide structure, that allow people to focus on living rather than constantly solving basic problems. Because when the essentials are taken care of, everything else becomes a little easier, a little less overwhelming. So as we let this gentle flow continue, from medicine to maps to engineering and movement, just allow your mind to settle into the pattern, the quiet confidence of a society that, despite its imperfections, understood the value of practical solutions, of steady improvement, of systems that work not just once, but again and again, reliably, without demanding attention. And as we move toward the final part of this journey, we'll bring all of these ideas together, seeing how these small, thoughtful inventions combine to create something much larger than themselves, a world that, in its own quiet way, helped shape the one you live in today. And as those maps fold gently back into place, and the physicians return to their slow routines, and the carts continue their steady journey across those familiar stone roads, we arrive, almost without noticing, at the final stretch of this calm Roman story, where everything we've been drifting through begins to settle together, not in a dramatic conclusion, but in the soft realization that these inventions were never really separate. They were all part of the same quiet intention, to make life work a little better, a little smoother, without too much noise about it. So imagine the Roman world not as a series of grand moments, but as a collection of ordinary days, people waking up, walking along those carefully built roads, drawing water from systems that had been designed long before they were born, living in spaces shaped by practical ideas that had slowly improved over time. And the interesting thing is, most of them probably didn't think about these systems at all, because when something works well, it tends to fade into the background, becoming part of the rhythm rather than something you actively notice. And that, in a very quiet way, is the real success of Roman invention. Not that it impressed people, not that it demanded attention, but that it became invisible, a natural part of daily life, like the feeling of walking on a smooth path instead of a rough one, or turning a handle and expecting water to appear. Simple expectations that only exist because someone, somewhere solved a problem long ago. Now, if we gently shift forward, beyond ancient Rome itself, into the long stretch of time that followed, something interesting begins to happen. These ideas don't disappear. They don't fade away completely. Instead, they linger, they evolve, they get rediscovered, reused, adapted by different cultures, different societies, all quietly building on the same foundation. Because a good idea, especially a practical one, tends to stick around, even if the people who created it are long gone. And you can almost trace these threads through history. Roads influencing future road systems, aqueduct principles shaping modern water supply, construction techniques inspiring new forms of architecture. All these small pieces continuing to exist in slightly different forms, like echoes that never fully fade, just changing shape as they move forward through time. Now, of course, not everything was carried forward perfectly. Some knowledge was lost, some systems fell into disrepair, and there were long periods where things became less organized, less efficient, as different societies faced their own challenges. But even then, the core ideas remained, waiting to be rediscovered, waiting to be improved again. Because once a solution exists, it has a way of resurfacing when people need it most. And as we slowly return to the present, it becomes a little easier to see how much of this quiet Roman thinking still surrounds you. Even if you don't notice it, the structured roads you travel on, the organized spaces you move through, the systems that provide water, manage waste, support daily routines, all of these things carry a trace of that same practical mindset, that same focus on making life manageable rather than complicated. And there's something oddly comforting about that. The idea that across thousands of years, despite all the changes, all the differences, people have been solving similar problems in similar ways, not because they had to copy the past, but because certain solutions simply make sense. They work, they endure, they quietly improve the experience of everyday life without needing constant attention or recognition. Now let's slow down even further, just for a moment, and return to that image of a Roman city at rest. The roads emptying as the day comes to an end, the lamps flickering softly, the water still flowing through unseen channels, the systems continuing their work even as people step away from them. And there's a kind of peaceful continuity in that, a sense that the world keeps moving, gently, steadily, without needing to rush. And maybe that's the most calming part of this entire story. Not the inventions themselves, but the way they were created, slowly, thoughtfully, without urgency, focused on solving real problems in ways that lasted. Because in a world that often feels fast and overwhelming, there's something reassuring about that slower approach, that quiet patience, that steady improvement over time. So as you settle into that thought, just let everything we've explored drift together. The aqueducts carrying water across distances, the roads connecting places and people, the tools shaping daily work, the systems organizing information, all these pieces forming a kind of background structure that supports life without demanding attention. And as you let your mind relax into that steady rhythm, it becomes easier to appreciate how much of the modern world is built on these same quiet ideas. And of course, the Romans themselves would probably find it a bit amusing, or perhaps mildly satisfying, that their practical solutions managed to last this long, quietly influencing lives far beyond anything they could have imagined. Not through grand gestures or dramatic inventions, but through simple, thoughtful improvements that just kept working, again and again over time. So as this calm journey comes to a close, there's no dramatic ending waiting for you, no sudden realization that changes everything, just a gentle awareness that sometimes the most important things are the ones you barely notice. The systems that work quietly in the background, making life a little easier, a little more predictable, a little more comfortable. And in that sense, the legacy of ancient Rome isn't something distant or abstract. It's something you experience every day, often without even realizing it. And with that, you can let the story slowly fade, like the last light of a Roman lamp dimming at the end of the evening. Steady, quiet, and completely at ease, knowing that everything it needed to do has already been done, and everything it created is still, in its own subtle way, continuing on. And even though everything has already settled into a soft ending, we can allow ourselves one last gentle drift, because the Roman world, like a slow evening, doesn't really stop all at once. It just gradually becomes quieter, softer, more distant, as if the entire empire is exhaling after a long and very productive day. So imagine once more those familiar streets, not busy now, not filled with carts and voices and footsteps, but calm, the kind of calm that comes when everything that needed to be done has already been done. And all that remains is the quiet presence of systems, continuing their work in the background, the aqueducts still carrying water, the roads still stretching out into the distance, the structures still standing with that patient, almost stubborn durability the Romans seemed to prefer. And somewhere in a modest home, a lamp is still glowing softly, not trying to light the whole world, just doing its small part, creating a circle of warmth and visibility. And there's something very fitting about that, because most Roman inventions were exactly like this, not overwhelming, not dramatic, just quietly useful, just enough to make life easier without asking for recognition. Now as the night deepens, you can almost imagine the city itself relaxing, the noise fading, the routines pausing, but the systems never quite stopping, because that's the thing about well-designed ideas. They don't need constant attention, They continue, steadily, reliably, even when no one is watching, and in a way, that's what made Roman inventions so powerful. Not their size, not their scale, but their consistency. And if we gently step back, just a little, and look at everything together one last time, it all begins to feel less like a collection of separate ideas, and more like a quiet philosophy, a way of approaching the world that says problems don't need to be dramatic. They don't need complicated solutions. They just need patience, observation, and a willingness to improve things step by step, even if the progress feels slow. Because the Romans didn't wake up one day and decide to invent everything all at once. They built, adjusted, improved, sometimes made mistakes, sometimes corrected them, and over time, those small efforts layered together into something much larger. Something that could support millions of lives without collapsing under its own weight, which, if you think about it, is actually quite an achievement, even if they didn't always get everything right. And there's something deeply calming in that idea, the slow accumulation of practical solutions, each one making the next step a little easier, until eventually life itself begins to feel more manageable, not perfect, not effortless, but stable, and sometimes stability is more valuable than anything else. Now, as we return gently to the present, you might notice, in a very quiet way, that this Roman mindset hasn't really disappeared. It's still here, in the background of modern life, in the systems you rely on without thinking, in the structures that hold everything together, in the small conveniences that make your day just a little smoother. And like the Romans, you probably don't think about them very often, because they simply work. And maybe that's the final, almost hidden lesson in all of this, that the best inventions are not the ones that demand attention, but the ones that disappear into everyday life, becoming so normal, so expected, that you forget they were ever invented at all. They just exist, quietly doing their job, like the steady flow of water through an ancient aqueduct that never really stopped flowing. So as you let this final part settle in, just allow your thoughts to slow down with it. No need to analyze, no need to remember every detail. Just the overall feeling, the calm rhythm of a world built on practical ideas, the quiet confidence of systems that work, the gentle understanding that progress doesn't always need to be loud to be meaningful. And as the last of that soft Roman evening fades, and the lamp finally dims, there's nothing left to do, nothing left to add, just a quiet sense of completion. Like a road that has reached exactly where it was always meant to go. Steady, simple, and completely at ease.